Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're gonna read chapters 47 and 48 out of Holes. So this is getting pretty intense. When we left off, both Stanley and Zero were covered in lizards. They had found the treasure of Kissing Kate Barlow, and they had been caught by the warden and Mr. Sir and Mr. Pendanski, and they were just waiting for them to die. And so we'll see what happens. Morning is coming. I don't need to show you this book. The sun was up and Stanley's heart was still beating. There were 8 lizards in the hole with him. Each one had exactly 11 yellow spots. The warden had dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep and lines across her forehead and her face, which seems exaggerated in the stark morning light. Her skin looked blotchy. "Satan," said Zero. Stanley looked at him, unsure if Zero had even spoken or if he had just imagined it. "Why don't you go and see if you can take the suitcase from Zero?" the warden suggested. "Yeah, right," said Mr. Sir. "The lizards obviously aren't hungry," said the warden. "Well, then you go take the suitcase," said Mr. Sir. They waited. "Satan Lee," said Zero. Sometime later, Stanley saw a tarantula crawl across the dirt not too far from his hole. He had never seen a tarantula before, but there was no doubt what it was. He was momentarily fascinated by it as his big hairy body moved slowly and steadily along. "Look, a tarantula," said Mr. Sir, also fascinated. "I've never seen one," said the warden, "except in..." Stanley suddenly felt a sharp sting on the side of his neck. The lizard hadn't bitten him, however, it was merely pushing off. It leapt off of Stanley's neck and it pounced on the tarantula. The last Stanley saw of it was one hairy leg sticking out of the lizard's mouth. "Not hungry, huh?" said Mr. Sir. Stanley tried to return to the snow, but it was harder to get there when the sun was up. Remember, he's thinking back to a happy memory of when he was in the snow with his mom. As the sun rose, the lizards moved lower in the hole, keeping mainly in the shade. They were no longer on his head and shoulders, but had moved down to his stomach, legs, and feet. He couldn't see any lizards on Zero, but he believed that there were 2 between Zero's knees, shaded from the sun by the suitcase. "How are you doing?" Stanley asked quietly. He didn't whisper, but his voice was dry and raspy. "My legs are numb," said Zero. "I'm going to try to climb out of the hole," Stanley said. As he tried to pull himself up, using just his arms, he felt a claw dig into his ankle. He gently eased himself back down. "Is your last name your first name backward?" Zero asked. Stanley stared at him in amazement. Had he been working on that all night? He heard the sound of approaching cars. Mr. Sir and the warden heard it as well. "You think it's them?" asked the warden. "It ain't Girl Scouts selling cookies," said Mr. Sir. He heard the cars come to a stop and the doors open and shut. A little while later, he saw Mr. Pendanski and 2 strangers coming across the lake. One was a tall man in a business suit and a cowboy hat. The other was a short woman holding a briefcase. The woman had to take 3 steps for every 2 taken by the man. "Stanley Yelnuts," she called, moving out ahead of the others. "I suggest you don't come any closer," said Mr. Sir. "You can't stop me," she snapped, and then she took a second glance at him, wearing pajama pants and nothing else. "We'll get you out of there, Stanley," she said. "Don't you worry." She appeared to be Hispanic, with straight black hair and dark eyes. She spoke with a little bit of a Mexican accent, trailing her R's. "What in tarnation?" the tall man exclaimed as he came up behind her. She turned on him. "I'm telling you right now, if any harm comes to him, we will be filing charges not only against Ms. Walker and Camp Green Lake, but the entire state of Texas as well. Child abuse, false imprisonment, torture." The man was more than a head taller than she was and was able to look directly over her as he spoke to the warden. "How long have they been in there?" "All night, as you can see by the way we're dressed. They snuck into my cabin while I was asleep and they stole my suitcase. I chased after them and they ran out here and they fell into the lizard's nest. I don't know what they were thinking." "That's not true," Stanley said. Stanley, as your attorney, I advise you not to say anything, said the woman, until you and I have had a chance to talk in private. Stanley wondered why the warden had lied about the suitcase. He wondered who it legally belonged to. That was one thing he wanted to ask his lawyer, if she really was his lawyer. It's a miracle they're still alive, said the tall man. Yes, it is, the warden agreed, with just a trace of disappointment in her voice. And they better come out of this alive, Stanley's lawyer warned. This wouldn't have happened if you had released him to me yesterday. It wouldn't have happened if he wasn't a thief, said the warden. I told him he would be set free today, and I guess he decided he would try to take some of my valuables with him. He's been delirious for the last week. Well, then why didn't you release him when she came to you yesterday? The tall man asked. She didn't have proper authorization, said the warden. I had a court order. It was not authenticated, said the warden. Authenticated? It was signed by the judge who sentenced him. I needed authentication from the Attorney General, said the warden. How do I know it's legitimate? The boys in my custody have proven themselves dangerous to society, and am I supposed to just turn them loose anytime someone hands me a piece of paper? Yes, said the woman, if it's a court order. Stanley has been hospitalized for the last few days, the warden explained. He has been suffering from hallucinations and delirium, ranting and raving. He was in no condition to leave. The fact that he was trying to steal from me on the day before his release proves. Stanley tried to climb out of his hole, using mostly his arms so as not to disturb the lizards too much. As he pulled himself upward, the lizards moved downward, keeping out of the sun's direct rays. He swung his legs up and over, and the last of the lizards hopped off. "Oh, thank God," the warden exclaimed, and she started towards him and then stopped. A lizard crawled out of his pocket and down his leg. Stanley was overcome by a rush of dizziness and almost fell over. He steadied himself, and then he reached down, took a hold of Zero's arm, and helped him slowly to his feet. Zero still held the suitcase. The lizards, which had been hiding under it, scurried quickly back into the hole. Stanley and Zero staggered away. The warden rushed to them. She hugged Zero. "Oh, thank God you're alive," she said, and then she tried to take the suitcase from him. He jerked it free. "It belongs to Stanley," he said. "Oh, don't cause any more trouble," the warden warned. "You stole it from my cabin, and you've been caught red-handed. If I press charges, Stanley might have to return to prison. Now, I am willing, in view of all circumstances, to—" "It's got his name on it," said Zero. Stanley's lawyer pushed past the tall man to have a look. "See?" Zero showed her. "Stanley Yelnats." Stanley looked too. There, in big black letters, was Stanley Yelnats. The tall man looked over the heads of the others at the name on the suitcase. "You say he stole it from your cabin?" The warden stared at it in disbelief. That's impossible. She couldn't even say it. All right, guys, we're on chapter 48. They slowly walked back to the camp. The tall man was the Texas Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer for the state. Stanley's lawyer was named Miss Marengo. Stanley held the suitcase. He was so tired he couldn't even think straight. He felt as if he were walking in a dream, not quite able to comprehend what was going on around him. They stopped in front of the camp office. Mr. Sir went inside to get Stanley's belongings. The Attorney General told Mr. Pendanski to get the boys something to eat and drink. The warden seemed as dazed as Stanley. "You can't even read," she said to Zero. Zero said nothing. Ms. Marengo put a hand on Stanley's shoulder and told him to hang in there. He would be seeing his parents soon. She was shorter than Stanley, but somehow gave the appearance of being tall. Mr. Pendanski returned with 2 cartons of orange juice and 2 bagels. Stanley drank the juice, but he didn't feel like eating anything. "Wait," the warden exclaimed. I didn't say that they stole it. That they stole the suitcase. It is his suitcase, obviously, but he must have put my things from my cabin inside of it." "That isn't what you said earlier," said Miss Marengo. "What's in the suitcase?" the warden asked Stanley. "Tell us what's in it, and then we'll open it and see." Stanley didn't know what to do. "Stanley, As your lawyer, I advise you not to open your suitcase, said Miss Marengo. He has to open it, said the warden. I have the right to check the personal property of the detainees. How do I know that there aren't any drugs or weapons in there? He stole a car, too. I've got witnesses. She was nearly hysterical. He is no longer under your jurisdiction, said Stanley's lawyer. He has not officially been released, said the warden. Open the suitcase, Stanley. Do not open it, said Stanley's lawyer. Stanley did nothing. Mr. Sir returned from the office with Stanley's backpack and clothes. The Attorney General handed Miss Marengo a sheet of paper. You're free to go, he said to Stanley. I know you're anxious to get out of here, so you can just keep the orange suit as a souvenir or burn it, whatever you want. Good luck, Stanley. He reached out his hand to shake, but Miss Marengo hurried Stanley away. Come on, Stanley, she said. We have a lot to talk about. Stanley stopped and turned to look at Zero. He couldn't just leave him there. Zero gave him the thumbs up. I can't leave Hector, Stanley said. I suggest we go, said his lawyer with a sense of urgency in her voice. I'll be okay, said Zero. His eyes shifted towards Mr. Pendanski on one side of him and then to the warden and Mr. Sir on the other. There's nothing I can do for your friend, said Miss Marengo. You are released pursuant to an order from the judge. But they'll kill him, said Stanley. Your friend is not in danger, said the Attorney General. There's going to be an investigation into everything that has happened here. For the present, I am taking charge of the camp. Come on, Stanley, said his lawyer. Your parents are waiting. Stanley stayed where he was. His lawyer sighed. Okay. May I have a look at Hector's file? She asked. Certainly, said the Attorney General. Ms. Walker, go get Hector's file. She looked at him blankly. Well? The warden turned to Mr. Pendanski. Bring me Hector Zeroni's file. He stared at her. Get it, she ordered. Mr. Pendanski went into the office. He returned a few minutes later and announced that the file was apparently misplaced. The Attorney General was outraged. What kind of a camp are you running here, Ms. Walker? The warden said nothing. She stared at the suitcase. The Attorney General assured Stanley's lawyer that he would get the records. Excuse me while I call my office. He turned back to the warden. I assume the phone works? He walked into the camp office, slamming the door behind him. A little while later, he reappeared and told the warden that he wanted to talk to her. She cursed and then went inside. Stanley gave Zero the thumbs up. Caveman, is that you? He turned around to see Armpit and Squid coming out of the rec room. Squid shouted back into the rec room, Caveman and Zero are out here. Soon all the boys from Group D had gathered around him and Zero. Good to see you, man, said Armpit, shaking his hand. We thought you were buzzard food. Stanley is being released today, said Mr. Pendanski. Way to go, said Magnet, hitting him on the shoulder. And you didn't even have to step on a rattlesnake, said Squid. Even Zigzag shook Stanley's hand. Sorry about, It's cool, said Stanley. We had to lift the truck clear out of the hole, Zigzag told him. It took everybody in C, D, and E. We just picked it right up. It was really cool, said Twitch. X-Ray was the only one who didn't come over. Stanley saw him hang back behind the others for a moment and then return to the rec room. Guess what, said Magnet, glancing at Mr. Pendanski. Mom says that we don't have to dig any more holes. That's great, Stanley said. Will you do me a favor? Asked Squid. I guess, Stanley agreed, somewhat hesitantly. I want you to... He turned to Ms. Marengo. Hey, lady, you have a pen and paper I can borrow? She gave it to him, and Squid wrote down a phone number, which he gave to Stanley. Call my mom for me, okay? Tell her I said I was sorry. Tell her Alan said that he was sorry. Stanley promised he would. Now, you be careful out there in the real world, said Armpit. Not everybody is as nice as us. Stanley smiled. The boys departed when the warden came out of her office. The Attorney General was right behind her. My office is having some difficulty locating Hector Zeroni's records, the Attorney General said. So you have no claim of authority over him? Asked Miss Marengo. I didn't say that. He's in the computer. We just can't access his records. It's like they've fallen through a hole in cyberspace. A hole in cyberspace? Miss Marengo repeated. How interesting. When is his release date? I don't know. How long has he been here? Like I said, we can't. So what are you planning to do with him? Keep him confined indefinitely without justification while you go crawling through black holes in cyberspace? The Attorney General stared at her. He was obviously incarcerated for a reason. Oh, and what reason was that? The Attorney General said nothing. Stanley's lawyer took a hold of Zero's hand. Come on, Hector. You're coming with us. All right. Tomorrow we're on chapter 49.